Thank you for joining us. I'm glad that we chose this seating arrangement because how tall are you?
Very tall.
Yeah, that's what I thought. When it came out at first, I thought, I bet this gentleman can dunk. All right, that's how I think. How to win a trade war. Boy, this would come in handy if we found ourselves in a trade war. Are we in a trade war?
Yeah.
We are in a trade war. With everyone?
Yeah.
Whole world. Are we winning? Oh boy. What? How would we know? Oh boy. Are we winning against anybody? Is Belgium? Are we beating Belgium?
So.
I feel like two doctors trying not to break bad news to me.
Yeah.
So we are, the trade war, let's be clear. We launched the trade war, correct?
Yes.
Liberation Day launched the trade war.
Yes.
You can speak more than one word.
Okay. So yes. So just over a year ago, Donald Trump decided to ignore the most basic military strategy and fight a war on all the fronts at the same time.
He launched a trade war against everybody.
Everybody.
Okay.
Everybody. And yeah, there is a reason you're not supposed to do that.
Would that be in here?
Maybe. And so stepping back, right? The problem in the global economy, there is a real trade problem in the global economy, and it's to do with the relationship with China. And that is a significant issue. And what would have been good is to work with allies, because
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
Because when you fight a war on all of the fronts, that means your allies are also fighting a war on all of the fronts. So suddenly, Europe was going to try to deal with the China issue, but now it's having to also deal with the US issue at the same time.
What would the metrics be of a trade? So how do we even judge whether or not, so we understand the strategy should not have been to fire on our allies as well as our rivals. What are the metrics of a trade war? How do we judge it?
I think the most important one is, can you do what you want? Or are you being constrained by your vulnerabilities to not be able to do what you want? I think that's the biggest key to show how we're losing now.
When we say, can we do what we want, we mean, can we sell our products where we want to sell them for the price we would like to sell them at?
That could be part of it.
Okay.
It could be that we want to impose policies. Maybe we're worried about certain countries out there that rhyme with Schmeina.
I had a different rhyme earlier, but yours works too.
And maybe you want to do things like tariffs or export restrictions or, be a little tough on certain issues, but you can't because you're worried about them standing up to you in a way that you're really vulnerable. And that's where we found ourselves last year. China has figured out how to play a trade war, how to at least win a trade war at the moment. And that's because we're vulnerable to a lot of things we need for our economy to work that really China is the only one out there that makes right now. And
how are we vulnerable? What is it that China does that makes us vulnerable?
They mine, process, manufacture into magnets something called rare earths.
Yes.
So they go into cars, into defense systems.
Electronics.
Yeah. I never thought I would know so much about rare earth supply chains, but here we are.
Right.
And essentially, China has been copying what the US has been doing, I think, because the US has been restricting exports to China for a while. And so the Chinese just looked at what the US was doing and said, okay, we can do that too.
So we do strategic restrictions, and you talk about this in the book, strategic restrictions on exports, meaning the one advantage we have is our chips are apparently second to none. We're apparently 2 to 3 months ahead of everybody else when it comes to chips. So we restrict that from going directly to China. That's our leverage.
And the equipment that goes into that is used to make the chips.
But we don't do that. That's done in Taiwan, is it not?
So we do some of it. We also work with allies. So Japan and the Netherlands, the Netherlands actually does the fanciest pieces of these equipment. We work with their government to say, hey, let's not send that stuff to China.
What is the fancy? What is it? Is that the part where they frost it at the end?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you stick your finger in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That worked. Boom.
Exactly.
Nice.
Yeah. But yeah, so we have been doing that kind of thing, but for military purposes, right? We're really worried about China getting hold of these super fancy chips because it would enhance their military capabilities, and that's why we didn't want to send it to them. China's doing something that's very different, not sending us these rare earths.
But they did that in response.
Yes, they did it in response.
They were not doing it prior to this.
Well, they have done it in the past. They did this back actually in 2010 when they got mad at Japan for something at the time.
But didn't Japan at that point get themselves a backlog, a stockpile of rare earths in preparation for this type of thing? Did we do that before launching this trade war? Son of a... Is that in the book?
Yeah, Japan got hit early and they prepared, right? And so they acted, in a very extreme way to reduce their reliance on China. They were ahead of the game. And then when China did it to everyone else last year, everyone else was looking to Japan to say, oh, well, why didn't we do that? Yeah.
So you're saying, if I may paraphrase, we launched a trade war rashly, too broadly, without proper preparation, and now find ourselves mired in an event that we are now losing. This is just so out of character for this administration that I don't know what got into them.
It's almost like trade wars are like real wars, right? Logistics win real wars. You need to prep.
Well, thank God we haven't launched one of those. Let me ask you a question. Do they, when you talk about it as being like a real war, do they war game trade? I understand that they would say, like, if you attack Iran, we war game it, and most times they close the Strait of Hormuz, and that's known. Do they war game trade wars?
Who's they?
The Illuminati? I don't know. You're the economist.
Yes. So some governments absolutely are doing this, right? And so I think
they plan it.
They plan it.
What might happen?
And not all of it's just the fear of trade war and real wars. I think we learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic when we ran short of products and we suddenly became very worried about supply chain vulnerabilities, right? Mm-hmm. We couldn't get access, to toilet paper initially, but then it became things like semiconductors, and all of a sudden governments all around the world started to look more closely at where they were getting some of these essential goods from. Mm-hmm. And they did really sophisticated data and analytic exercises to try to figure it out. And then many of them have done wargaming exercises to try to figure out how to minimize a lot of those vulnerabilities. I'm not so sure that was the approach that this administration took when they came in last January.
You're not so sure? So the idea, though, is a country is looking to assess its vulnerabilities, assess its strengths, and shore up those vulnerabilities to create resilience. Now, what we've been told is the reason we launched this trade war is to reverse the years of hollowing out manufacturing. But that sounds backwards to me. Wouldn't you use other methodologies to increase manufacturing before launching a trade war so that you would be more resilient in that war?
Yeah, it's a good point.
So more positively, I think you have a future ahead of you in policy.
In trade wars. I could launch a trade war. Let me ask you this. So we talk about this, and it's very interesting because the analogy is launching a real war, and we talk about this as it really is a form of nationalism. Where do corporations fit into the playing field in trade wars? Because we're talking, you're going after China, you're going after the Netherlands, you're going after the EU. Multinational corporations have no allegiance. Who are they in all this?
So I think multinationals are the soldiers in the trade war, right? The governments make the policy, they're the commanders, and then the companies are the ones actually implementing it, right? And so if we think back to those vulnerabilities, ultimately those are the product of companies responding to incentives, right? For years, it was cheap. It was efficient to buy your components from China, right? That was where all the other manufacturing was, and policymakers encouraged them. And now what we're seeing is the result of those companies responding to those incentives and saying, oh, wait, what? The Chinese can suddenly cut us off? It's also, US car companies that are sourcing from China, all those rare earths.
Are we in a position, because you said that they're the soldiers in our war, it almost appears to me that they're actually the soldiers that started the war. Because globalization and the introduction of China into the WTO and all that, capital travels, but labor can't. So when these companies who are built in Silicon Valley or wherever it is, using the infrastructure of the United States. Silicon Valley doesn't exist without taxpayer funding and government resources and any of those things. We built them. And then they could just go, these guys, we're going to where we don't have to pay our workers anything, and we get to do everything, and we can hollow out the very country that made us possible. And now we've got to fight a trade war to beg them to come back? China would never put up with that, would they?
No.
Not to go on a Jeremiah, but I don't understand how they're allowed to get us into this mess, and then we've got to figure out a way to get out of it.
Yeah, so there's a couple things there. One, I think China has very different relationships with its companies than we do. And I think one of the, the way we should think about companies these days is they're really not American companies. They're multinationals. They're themselves. They're their own entities, and we can't expect them, as Soumaya put it, to kind of fight our battles for us, right? Unless you incentivize them to, unless you create the right regulations to force them to behave in certain ways, they're just going to act in their own interests. And if that means going and getting, where workers are cheaper, that's what they're going to do, and that's where they're going to make things. Now, there are some benefits to that, though, too, right? We actually do get, through international trade, access to much cheaper products than we would otherwise. And I think we've seen today with inflation, right? People like it when prices are lower than when prices are higher. So there are lots of benefits from trade that we don't completely want to eliminate. But I think we do need to recognize that does sometimes come with costs, right? And especially costs for workers. And that has to be something that's dealt with as well.
Why then are governments incentivized to always lubricate the way for corporations, but not workers? Why are workers just always the inevitable victims of all of this? Of all of these shenanigans? It's hard to understand that the government wouldn't put some limitations. If you want access to our infrastructure, you can't just screw over our workers because it's easier.
Yeah.
Part of it, I think, is the political process, right? In Washington, it's much easier for the big companies to organize and lobby and get the policies that they want, and it's much more difficult for workers to do.
So they're not soldiers; they're mercenaries. They're Blackwater. They're really not. They're not soldiers because soldiers take an oath to the nation that birthed them, and they don't. So how in a trade war? Because how does it figure in a trade war that we can come to a better understanding with these corporations of what our expectations are for them?
So I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is it's trying to reset that bargain, right? So it's saying, you if you want to serve US customers, then you've got to operate in the US. And it's trying to do that with its trade tools. And I think the tricky reality is that it's extremely hard to force these mercenary companies to do that, right? And so the risk is that you end up essentially taxing imports, right? So you put up tariffs, you make it harder for companies to get stuff from overseas, and what those companies do is they don't reshore, they just do less of everything, right? It can be really, really, the problem that you identify is real. The challenge is getting that trade war then to sort of solve that problem, right? That link isn't...
That's exactly it, because it seems to me that, now we're going after China and the EU, but we're still not addressing the elephant in the room, which is these free agent mercenaries. So let me ask you this, if this is a reasonable... there's a lot of times that someone might say, all right, we'll pay for your college, but you have to give us 4 years of service as a teacher in these certain districts. It's a way for us to get the people that we need, to give them something, but to expect something in return. Is that the type of arrangement that can be done for the tax money and infrastructure that we use to build these companies?
Yeah, I was just going to say there are things that I think we can do that treat corporations differently, but it's not through tariffs, right? So I think
not through trade wars.
This
is not a good way to do it.
No, I mean there's been efforts over the last 10 years to try to get global corporations to not be tax evaders, right? To not go to tax haven countries, to have them pay minimum taxes somewhere in the world, right? I think that's a more effective strategy at trying to get these companies to behave and be, kind of better global corporate citizens than just whacking them with tariffs, because with tariffs come all the bad things. Best case scenario, maybe they do bring some of that production back to the United States. We get more manufacturing here. But because we've made it so expensive because of tariffs for them to do so, they can't hire any workers. And they just have to do it all with robots, right? And at the end of the day, how does that really help us if we're really worried about the American worker, right?
You bring something up in the book that I thought was really interesting about wage insurance. And it was something, because my concern is that there are casualties in trade wars that are the multinationals. He's cutting deals with Apple and Intel and NVIDIA and all these big players. But the people that are suffering are the small businesses in America, the people that don't like uncertainty and can't adjust their business practices to all these fluctuating tariffs and all these other changing things. But there's a program you mentioned called wage insurance. And it's generally done, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you lose a job in manufacturing because it was globalized and you get another job that isn't paying as well, the government provides you the money up to that level. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's a certain share of the difference, basically. So they're cushioning that blow, right? So if you've just lost your job, that means that you have some help, right? You've got a cushion, right? And so your income doesn't fall. You're also encouraged to get a new job. Maybe you switch to a new industry, something that isn't so vulnerable to all those globalization forces. And the evidence that we have suggests that it actually can pay for itself, which is kind of never heard of in economic policies. So I think over the last couple of decades, economists have really beaten themselves up about, helping the people who are left behind by globalization. And because trade tools are so bad at helping the worker, really what you need is better, worker protections, including potentially programs like that one.
Right. So let me ask you a question, which brings up the point. What if we use that preemptively in our war? So rather than wage insurance to help people in areas that have been hollowed out by globalization, use wage insurance to go to those companies who were going to go overseas and say, we will make up at least most of the difference between what you would pay your workers in China and what you would pay them in Kentucky. And we do that preemptively so those communities never get hollowed out in the first place. Could that be part of an industry and industrial policy that actually, rather than how to win a trade war, a book on, the next book, the sequel, how to survive a trade war? Yeah. Would that be a possible solution?
100%. There's so much more that we can do in terms of adjusting the tax code to make it more beneficial for companies to hire workers and not have to pay sort of extraordinary taxes and other burdens and things like that. And I think that's really what the emphasis should be on.
How does this wind down? How do we find our way out of this? Do you have an idea? Have you seen this play out before?
So I've got
There's a lot of sighing going on here.
Yeah.
Well, I've got a confession, right? So it's an optimistic guide, and we
What?
We go through some scenarios, right, for how we could get ourselves out of this. Yeah. And my confession is that a lot of the happy sunlit uplands are quite a long way in the future.
Yeah, there's a lot of 2050 in this.
Yeah, it's a lot of 2050. And so, right now I think we're a bit worried that things are going to have to get worse before they get better. But eventually, it really should be possible for us all to come together and stop brandishing all these trade weapons again. Look, this is optimistic.
This is very,
Yeah. Eventually, we should be able to get together and do something that's, mutually beneficial so we can escape the chaos.
Chad?
This is not going away. You were just talking.
Have you guys talked to each other about this?
Yeah, I'm the optimistic one in the book, actually. She's the pessimistic.
All right.
No, the issue's not going away. You just gave all this great advice to graduates, right? Saddle up.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for coming by. How to Win a Trade War. May 26th, available for pre-order. Soumaya Keynes and Chad Bown.